A ruthless gang, a corrupt empire, one lone man, Chuck Norris, takes them all down. But when the real enemy emerges, the war begins. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a jagged scar of cracked pavement slicing through the barren desert like a forgotten path to nowhere. The only company was the occasional tumbleweed tumbling aimlessly across the road, and the deep, inky sky above, speckled with stars that seemed to watch in silence. The moon hung low, casting long, ghostly shadows against the jagged rock formations that loomed in the distance. Chuck Norris sat behind the wheel of his battle-worn pickup truck, the engine purring beneath his steady hands. The old vehicle had seen its share of miles, dusted with the scars of past journeys, but it still ran smooth beneath the masterful grip of a man who had long since learned that the road was both an escape and a test. Tonight, the road was quiet. Too quiet. The truck's radio crackled, spitting out broken fragments of an old outlaw country tune, haunting, lonely, and soaked in memories that Chuck had no intention of revisiting. His sharp blue eyes scanned the horizon as his mind remained razor-focused on the road. Peace was an illusion, a thin veil stretched over something darker, something lurking just beneath the surface. And then he saw it. A flickering neon sign, glowing in the distance like a single ember in the vast darkness. The letters sputtered, fighting against age and neglect, but Chuck could still make out the words, "The Devil's Hollow Saloon." It was the only sign of civilization for miles, a lone outpost in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where truckers, drifters, and outlaws stopped for a drink, the kind of place where men disappeared, and no one bothered to ask why. Chuck eased off the accelerator, rolling toward the entrance, his instincts sharpening like a blade. The parking lot was a graveyard of forgotten vehicles, an old semi-truck with its headlights dim, a rusted-out Cadillac missing its windows, and a row of sleek black motorcycles lined up near the front like sleeping beasts. The sight of them gave him pause. Not bikers. No, these weren't the kind of men who lived by a code. These were vultures, predators, the kind that thrived in places where no one cared if you screamed. Chuck killed the engine, the deep growl of the truck fading into the eerie stillness of the desert. He stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel, the scent of scorched asphalt and distant rain thick in the air. A storm was coming, but not just the kind that brewed in the sky. His eyes flicked upward. Dark clouds were creeping across the moon, swallowing its silver glow. The wind carried a whisper through the empty land, a warning only a man like Chuck knew how to hear. He walked forward. The Devil's Hollow Saloon stood before him, its wooden exterior rotting at the edges, its windows stained with years of dust and regret. The neon light above the entrance buzzed weakly, casting an ominous red glow that bled into the ground beneath it. Chuck pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air inside was thick, choked with the smell of cheap whiskey, burnt grease, and the unmistakable stench of trouble. Dim lanterns hung from rusted chains, casting pools of uneven light over the warped floorboards. A jukebox in the corner played an old blues tune, but the notes were drowned beneath the murmurs of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Then he saw them. A group of men huddled in the farthest corner of the saloon. They weren't truckers, and they weren't locals. They were the Black Vultures, a gang of ex-prison enforcers turned outlaws, men who had made their money breaking bones and spilling blood for people who paid enough to look the other way. They wore no cuts, no patches, just dark, tattered clothes and the kind of dead-eyed stares that told you they didn't just win fights. They finished them. Chuck could feel their eyes on him the second he walked in. The biggest of them, a scar-faced brute with knuckles like iron, leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood echoing in the tense silence. He ran his fingers over the jagged scar, running from his temple to his chin, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. The leader. His name was Royce Calloway, and he was the kind of man who enjoyed breaking people just to see what was inside. Chuck ignored him. He walked to the bar, took a seat, and met the bartender's wary gaze, a burly man with tired eyes and hands that shook slightly as he wiped down the counter. "Coffee," Chuck said. His voice was calm, steady. The bartender hesitated, flicking a nervous glance toward Royce's table, then back at Chuck. "Are you sure you want to be here, mister?" he muttered under his breath. Chuck lifted his cup as the bartender poured, his sharp eyes never leaving Royce's reflection in the greasy mirror behind the bar. "I don't start trouble," Chuck said. Behind him, a chair scraped against the floor. Heavy boots moved across the wooden planks, slow and deliberate. Chuck didn't turn around. A large shadow loomed over him, bringing the scent of whiskey, sweat, and arrogance. Then, the voice. Low. Smug. "You lost, cowboy?" Chuck took a slow sip of his coffee, and just like that, the storm arrived. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The air inside the Devil's Hollow Saloon had grown heavier, thick with the kind of tension that clung to the skin like humidity before a storm. Chuck Norris, seated at the bar, could feel it creeping up his spine, pressing against his back like a loaded gun. He had walked into places like this before, places where the strong thrived and the weak prayed they weren't noticed. Tonight, he had been noticed. Behind him, a chair scraped against the warped wooden floor, its echo slicing through the low hum of conversation. The bartender, who had moments ago given Chuck a quiet warning, tensed slightly, his weathered hands gripping the bar towel, just a little too tight. Boots approached, slow, heavy, deliberate. Chuck didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could already smell the man closing in, a cocktail of cheap whiskey, stale cigarettes, and the unmistakable scent of arrogance. The voice came, laced with a smirk. "You lost, old man?" Chuck took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't acknowledge the question, didn't react to the deliberate way the words had been drawn out, testing him. Instead, he set his cup down gently, his fingers tapping the rim once. A habit, a calculation. Behind him, the room seemed to shift. Conversations faltered. The jukebox hummed on, but the easy laughter that had filled the air moments ago was gone. He could feel their eyes on him now. Another voice, sharper, younger, eager. "Guess you don't hear so good. Royce asked you a question." Ah, Royce Calloway. Chuck had already figured out the leader of the Black Vultures, but hearing the name confirmed it. Royce had a reputation that slithered ahead of him like a rattlesnake on warm sand. Ex-prison enforcer turned loan shark, the kind of man who made his living making sure people remembered to fear him. Chuck exhaled through his nose, finally turning just enough to glance over his shoulder. Royce was exactly what he expected. Mid-40s, built thick with muscle that had started to go soft, his face a roadmap of old fights and bad choices. A deep scar ran down his cheek like a jagged canyon, and his dull, predatory eyes gleamed under the low lights of the saloon. The younger one beside him was taller, leaner, all attitude and misplaced confidence. Milo, Chuck figured. Probably in his late 20s, the kind of man who hadn't lost enough fights yet to know when to back down. Chuck shifted his gaze back to his coffee. Not lost. His voice was calm, smooth, like a blade being sharpened against stone. Milo let out a low chuckle. That right? 'Cause this ain't the kind of place you just walk into, have yourself a nice little drink, and go about your night. Chuck didn't respond. Milo's grin widened, and Chuck could hear Royce shifting his weight slightly, letting his lackey have his fun. For now. Then came the shove. A hand on Chuck's shoulder, rough, demanding. Chuck didn't move. Silence followed. The bartender's knuckles whitened against the rag in his grip. A glass clinked somewhere behind the bar, the only sound in the stillness. Royce let out a slow exhale. Milo. Milo's smirk faltered. Royce stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on Milo's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make the younger man wince. You don't start with the small stuff. Royce's voice was a low growl. You go straight for the throat. Before Chuck could blink, Royce grabbed his coffee cup and flung it to the floor. The ceramic shattered, coffee spilling across the warped wood like blood from a fresh wound. The tension in the room turned electric. Chuck's fingers flexed against the bar. He let out a slow breath, staring at the mess on the floor for a long moment. Then, finally, he turned. The room seemed to hold its breath. Chuck's gaze met Royce's, cold and steady. That was a mistake. Milo barked out a laugh. Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it, Grandpa? Royce's smirk widened. He took a step closer, his fingers twitching slightly. An old boxer's habit. Testing the waters. See, I got a problem, Royce murmured. A man like you walks in here, all quiet and mysterious, drinking coffee like this, is some roadside diner instead of my bar. He tilted his head slightly. That kind of thing rubs me the wrong way. Chuck nodded slightly. Sounds like your problem. A low murmur rippled through the bar. Milo let out a sharp, mocking whistle. You believe this guy? Royce's smirk didn't fade. He stepped in closer, standing just inside Chuck's space now, his breath thick with whiskey. Tell you what, he mused. Why don't you finish what's left of your coffee? He gestured to the mess on the floor. And then get the hell out of my bar, before I decide to break you in half. Chuck stared at him. The moment stretched, the weight of the room pressing down, waiting, anticipating. Then, Chuck's lips barely moved. No. The single word dropped like a hammer. Royce's smirk finally faded. Chuck saw it coming before Royce even moved. The slight shift in his stance, the tightening of his jaw. A punch was coming, a big, dumb, overconfident swing. Royce's fist came fast, a freight train aimed for Chuck's head. Chuck moved faster. With an effortless precision, he leaned just enough to the side to let the punch sail past his jaw, by mere inches. Royce's momentum carried him forward, and in that brief second of vulnerability, Chuck struck. His elbow drove into Royce's ribs with pinpoint accuracy, knocking the wind from his lungs. Before Royce could react, Chuck's boot snapped out, hooking behind Royce's leg and sweeping it out from under him. Royce crashed to the floor. The room froze. Chuck took a single step forward, looking down at him. Now, he said coolly, are we done, or does this get ugly? Milo's hand twitched toward his belt. Chuck saw it, and just like that, the fight was about to begin. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The tension inside the Devil's Hollow Saloon had settled into something thick and palpable. The kind of pressure that builds just before a storm unleashes its fury. Chuck Norris remained still at the bar, his expression unreadable, his posture as relaxed as if he were simply enjoying his drink. If his coffee hadn't been shattered on the floor by Royce Calloway's arrogance. Royce, now back on his feet after Chuck had effortlessly dropped him, wasn't laughing anymore. The air of smugness had been replaced by something darker, something far more dangerous. A man whose authority had just been questioned in front of his own people. The younger man beside him, Milo, wasn't hiding his anger either. His fingers twitched toward his belt, where a serrated hunting knife gleamed under the dim lights. He wasn't just itching for a fight. He was eager to spill blood. Chuck could see it all unfolding in slow motion, the predictable dance of men who mistook confidence for weakness. Royce wiped a hand across his mouth, his breath uneven, his pride still bruised. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, he turned back to Chuck. "You know," he said, rolling his shoulders, "a man like you, someone who don't belong, makes you wonder." Chuck didn't bite. He had no interest in Royce's mind games. Royce, of course, took that silence as an invitation to keep talking. "Makes you wonder what kind of fool walks into my bar, acts like he don't hear when he's spoken to, and lays his hands on me like he's got the right." He chuckled low, but there was no humor in it. His eyes burned with something volatile. "Makes you wonder what should happen to a man like that." Chuck gave him a slow, level look. "I think you already know." For the first time, Royce hesitated. There was something in Chuck's voice. Something solid. Something unwavering. It wasn't a challenge. It was a simple truth. Royce clenched his jaw. His ego wouldn't let this slide. He turned toward his men, gesturing lazily at Chuck as if putting on a show. "Boys, tell me, what do we do with a man who don't know his place?" The bar had gone eerily silent now. The few patrons who weren't part of the Black Vultures had begun shifting in their seats, their instincts telling them that they were sitting inside a powder keg. One of Royce's men, a wiry ex-con named Deacon, leaned forward with a grin. "I'd say we help him understand." Milo cracked his knuckles. "Maybe teach him some respect." Chuck exhaled through his nose. He had been in situations like this before. The predictable back and forth, the mob mentality, the false bravado of men who had never faced someone like him. He had walked through more dangerous storms than this one, and tonight would be no different. Royce watched him closely, his fingers tapping against his belt, his stance shifting slightly. He was ready to make a move. And then, he did. In a flash, Royce reached for his whiskey bottle and swung it hard toward Chuck's head. Chuck moved first. Before the glass could connect, Chuck sidestepped the attack with effortless precision. The bottle swung through empty air, and in the same motion, Chuck caught Royce's wrist mid-swing, twisting it with just enough force to send a shockwave of pain through his arm. The bottle slipped from Royce's grip, shattering against the floor. And just like that, chaos erupted. Milo lunged, knife flashing. Chuck caught his wrist, stopping the blade inches from his ribs, and in a single fluid motion, he twisted Milo's arm behind his back and drove him face first into the bar. The impact was brutal, the sound of bone meeting wood echoing through the room. Before Milo could even groan, Deacon charged from the side. Chuck ducked under the wild punch, driving his elbow into Deacon's ribs so hard it sent the man sprawling backward, crashing into a table that splintered under his weight. Royce, recovering from his failed attack, roared in frustration and came at Chuck like a bull. Big mistake. Chuck sidestepped at the last second, hooked his foot behind Royce's ankle, and sent the man stumbling forward. Before Royce could react, Chuck delivered a precise, devastating palm strike to his chest, sending him crashing into a row of bar stools. The bartender, still behind the counter, wisely ducked. One of Royce's men tried to grab Chuck from behind, but before he could even lock his arms around him, Chuck drove his head backward, smashing into the man's nose. Blood spattered across the floor as the man collapsed with a whimper. The fight lasted no more than 10 seconds. And yet, by the time the dust settled, Royce Calloway and his men were sprawled across the saloon, groaning in pain, their arrogance shattered alongside the wreckage of broken furniture. Chuck took a single step forward, staring down at Royce. The once feared leader of the Black Vultures looked up at him, panting, his eyes darting wildly between Chuck and his fallen men. Chuck picked up the few crumpled bills he had placed on the counter earlier and dropped them in front of Royce. "That should cover my coffee." The saloon was silent. Royce, still on the floor, coughed and wiped blood from his lip, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't just beaten. He was broken. Chuck turned on his heel and walked toward the door. Milo, still holding his broken nose, spat blood onto the floor and rasped, "You should have just left." Chuck paused at the doorway. His gaze shifted slightly, his voice low but unwavering. "You should have let me drink my coffee." With that, he stepped into the night. Behind him, Royce Calloway lay in the ruins of his own ego, staring up at the ceiling, realizing he had never stood a chance. The storm outside was coming, but inside the Devil's Hollow Saloon, it had already passed. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The scent of blood lingered in the Devil's Hollow Saloon, mixing with spilled whiskey and the acrid burn of shattered pride. Chuck Norris stood among the wreckage of broken tables and groaning bodies, his expression as calm as ever, his stance relaxed. The Black Vultures lay scattered across the floor, their egos crushed along with their bones. For any reasonable man, that would have been the end of it. But Royce Calloway wasn't a reasonable man. He dragged himself upright, his breath ragged, his face twisted with a mix of rage and disbelief, his fingers curled into tight fists, his knuckles white, his body swaying like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His empire, his dominance over this place, had been shattered in mere moments. The bar, once his personal kingdom, had turned into his humiliation ground. Milo, still clutching his broken nose, staggered to his feet, eyes wild with fury. "You don't walk out of here, old man." His voice was thick with blood, but his grip on the handle of a serrated blade was steady. Chuck sighed. They always choose the hard way. The bartender, still hiding behind the counter, cleared his throat. "Boys, maybe you—" Crack! Royce slammed his fist against the bar, cutting the bartender off. His breath came in ragged gulps, his veins pulsing with desperation. "Shut up." His voice had lost its amusement, its false bravado. Now, it was just venom. Chuck barely spared him a glance. "You sure you want to do this?" Royce wiped the blood from his lip, his body shaking with a mix of fury and exhaustion. "You think you're just gonna walk out?" Chuck exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "That's the plan." Royce's lips curled into something twisted, something broken. "That's not how this ends." And then, before anyone could react, he reached into his coat and pulled out a .38 revolver. The saloon fell deathly silent. A gun changed everything. Chuck's eyes flicked to the weapon, steady, unshaken. He had faced worse. The few conscious men in the bar shifted nervously, their earlier bravado replaced by unease. The bartender shrank back against the wall, knowing exactly how fast things could go south. Milo, grinning through his pain, took a step forward. "Yeah, let's see how tough you are now." Royce raised the gun, aiming it directly at Chuck's chest. His hands were still shaking, but not enough to miss at this range. His nostrils flared as he breathed through his bruised ribs. "I should put you down right here." Chuck didn't blink. "You won't." The room held its breath. Royce's fingers tensed around the trigger. Chuck took a single step forward. A flicker of doubt flashed across Royce's face. "Stay where you are." Another step. Royce's pulse pounded in his ears. The gun trembled, but only slightly. Chuck's voice was impossibly calm. "You pull that trigger. You better be ready for what comes next." Royce swallowed. He had threatened plenty of men in his time, had looked into plenty of scared eyes, had felt the power of holding a man's life at his fingertips. But this wasn't like that. Chuck wasn't scared, not 1 ounce. Royce's hand shook harder. He realized, too late, that he wasn't the one in control anymore. Chuck took one last step, now inches from the barrel. "Go ahead." His voice was barely a whisper. "But if you miss..." The silence stretched thin, suffocating. Royce knew he wouldn't miss, but something about Chuck's voice made him realize that it wouldn't matter. Then, in a blur of motion faster than thought, Chuck's hand snapped up, his fingers locking around the barrel of the gun, twisting it with expert precision. Royce's wrist cracked with a sickening pop. He let out a strangled yell as the gun tumbled from his fingers. Before it could hit the floor, Chuck caught it and, in a single fluid motion, unloaded the chamber, the bullets clattering uselessly onto the floor. The gun was empty before Royce could even react. Chuck tossed the revolver onto the bar like a discarded toy. The fight was over. Royce cradled his wrist, his breath ragged, his confidence completely shattered. Milo, still clutching his knife, took a cautious step back. The fear had set in now. Chuck's gaze swept over the ruined saloon, the wreckage of what had once been the Black Vultures. Then he looked down at Royce. "You should have let me finish my coffee." Royce didn't answer. He couldn't. Chuck turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps the only sound in the stillness. No one dared to move. No one dared to stop him. At the threshold he paused. The desert air had cooled, the storm still brewing somewhere beyond the hills. He glanced back one last time. Royce sat slumped against the bar, his head down, his empire in ruins. Milo, still breathing heavily, couldn't even look at him. Chuck exhaled, then stepped out into the night. The door creaked shut behind him. The storm was coming. But inside the Devil's Hollow Saloon, it had already passed, and Royce Calloway would never be the same again. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The night air outside the Devil's Hollow Saloon was thick with the scent of distant rain and dust. But inside, the stench of sweat, blood, and spilled whiskey painted a different atmosphere. The floor was littered with broken glass, overturned chairs, and groaning bodies. Chuck Norris stood at the center of it all, calm, unwavering, and utterly untouched. Royce Calloway had lost his footing, both physically and as the so-called king of this saloon. His men had tried, and they had failed. But Chuck knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The bar had gone silent, except for the low, heavy breathing of the Black Vultures, who still clutched at their bruises, too battered to make another move. But Royce wasn't done. The leader of the Vultures slowly straightened himself, rolling his shoulders, cracking his neck from side to side. The smirk was gone now, replaced with something else, something cold, calculating. "Gotta say," Royce muttered, wiping the blood from his split lip, "I didn't expect that." He stretched out his arms, flexing his fingers. "But me? I don't go down like my men." Chuck didn't respond. He had already seen what kind of man Royce was, the type who needed to prove himself, even when the fight was already lost, the type who couldn't stand being second to anyone. Royce chuckled low, shaking his head. "I was hoping to avoid this," he admitted. "But now, I think I gotta remind everyone here exactly why I run this place." His stance shifted, his body lowering slightly as he squared up. Chuck recognized it immediately. Royce was no amateur. He wasn't some street thug throwing wild swings, hoping one would land. No, this man had trained. Boxing, maybe. Probably bare-knuckle fights in underground circuits. Good. Chuck exhaled and let the silence stretch between them. The bartender had retreated behind the counter, his hands gripping the edge, eyes wide. The few patrons who hadn't run were pressed against the walls, too afraid to move. The moment stretched thin, the air thick with tension. Then Royce moved. He was fast. Faster than Chuck had anticipated for a man his size. He came in low, throwing a brutal left hook meant to take Chuck's head off. Chuck leaned back just in time, the fist slicing through the air inches from his chin. But Royce wasn't done. He pivoted, sending a powerful right straight toward Chuck's ribs. A solid hit. If it had landed. Chuck twisted, letting the punch slide past him, catching Royce's wrist mid-motion. With an effortless turn, he yanked Royce forward and delivered a knee straight into his gut. The air rushed from Royce's lungs with a violent wheeze. But he didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, bracing through the pain, and countered with an elbow toward Chuck's jaw. Chuck blocked it with ease. And then, Chuck hit back. One lightning-fast jab to the ribs, a devastating uppercut to the chin. Royce's head snapped back, but he wasn't out yet. He stumbled, catching himself, blinking rapidly to clear the stars. Then Chuck ended it. With a swift, precise motion, he stepped in and sent a brutal spinning kick straight into Royce's chest. The force sent Royce crashing backward. The heavy wooden table behind him shattered under the impact as his body slammed into it, the sound of breaking wood echoing through the saloon. For a second, no one breathed. Royce stayed down. The once mighty leader of the Black Vultures groaned, his body refusing to obey him. He blinked up at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He had never lost like this before. Chuck stepped forward, his boots crunching against broken glass as he loomed over the fallen man. Royce looked up at him, fear finally flickering in his eyes. Chuck studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You done?" Royce swallowed, his lips twitching, but he didn't answer. Chuck crouched slightly, his voice quiet, dangerous. "Because if you get up again, I won't stop next time." A shudder ran through Royce's battered body. He understood. Finally, after a long, painful moment, Royce gave a weak nod. The fight was over. Chuck stood, exhaling through his nose. He had seen men like Royce before, men who thought they were invincible until they weren't. And tonight? Royce Calloway had learned that lesson the hard way. The bar was dead silent. The remaining Black Vultures had pressed themselves into the shadows, not daring to make a move. Chuck turned, grabbed the few remaining bills from the bar, and tossed them down. For the mess. The bartender, still too stunned to speak, gave a shaky nod. Without another word, Chuck walked toward the door. The wooden planks groaned under his weight as he pushed it open, stepping out into the cool desert air. The night was still. The storm had passed, but the electricity in the air lingered. Behind him, inside that ruined saloon, Royce Calloway would never be the same again. And as Chuck walked toward his truck, one thing was clear. No one in Devil's Hollow would ever forget this night. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The neon glow of the Devil's Hollow Saloon faded into the darkness as Chuck Norris stepped into the cool desert night. The distant rumble of thunder still lingered on the horizon, promising a storm, but the real storm had already passed. Inside, Royce Calloway lay broken, his once mighty Black Vultures reduced to a heap of battered bodies and shattered pride. Chuck inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. The town was silent, the only sound coming from the wind whipping across the cracked asphalt of the abandoned highway. His truck sat where he had left it, covered in a fine layer of dust, a lone sentinel waiting patiently for its master. But something felt off. A presence, a shift in the air. Chuck paused. His instincts, honed by decades of experience, screamed at him. He wasn't alone. His eyes swept the parking lot, the dim lighting casting long, jagged shadows. And then he saw them. Two black SUVs, parked at the far end of the lot. No headlights, no movement. But he knew better. They were watching. Chuck exhaled slowly, unfazed. He had dealt with men like this before, the kind who preferred to lurk in the dark, waiting for their moment. He took another step toward his truck. That's when the driver's side door of the first SUV opened. A figure stepped out. Tall, lean, but with the kind of presence that didn't need to be announced. The man adjusted his tailored black suit, the fabric barely creasing despite the movement. His slicked-back silver hair gleamed under the weak glow of the saloon's dying neon lights. Chuck didn't recognize him, but he recognized the type. The kind of man who never got his hands dirty, the kind who paid others to do it for him. The man smiled. "Mr. Norris, quite the display back there." Chuck said nothing. The man took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. "Royce Calloway was useful to us, in his way. Crude, yes. Undisciplined. But he had his uses." Chuck glanced back at the saloon, then returned his gaze to the stranger. "Not anymore." The man chuckled, nodding slightly. "So it seems." The passenger door of the second SUV opened. Another man stepped out, this one younger, bulkier, meaner. His suit was looser, the bulge under his jacket obvious. A gun. Chuck barely acknowledged him. He knew the real threat wasn't the muscle. It was the man in front of him. The silver-haired stranger spread his arms in an exaggerated gesture. "Allow me to introduce myself. Malcolm Grayson. And I believe you just disrupted one of my investments." Chuck tilted his head slightly. "Investment?" Grayson's smile didn't falter. "Royce and his men. They were a conduit. They moved product for me, let's say. A certain level of controlled chaos is useful in a place like this." He gestured toward the saloon. "But now, thanks to you, that conduit is broken." Chuck remained silent, reading between the lines. Drugs, guns, maybe worse. Royce Calloway wasn't just some two-bit gang leader. He had been a pawn in something much bigger. And now, Chuck had just toppled a piece on the board. Grayson took another step forward, his eyes gleaming like a snake sizing up its prey. "That leaves me with a dilemma, you see." Chuck shifted his stance slightly. "Here it comes." Grayson clasped his hands behind his back. "You're an anomaly, Mr. Norris. You don't belong here. You don't work for me. But you've made yourself relevant." Chuck exhaled through his nose. "You're wasting my time." For the first time, Grayson's smirk faltered. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before vanishing just as quickly. The bulkier man, Grayson's enforcer, shifted slightly, his fingers twitching near his jacket. Chuck caught it instantly. The man was waiting for a signal. Grayson sighed. "I was hoping we could be civil about this." Then he nodded. The enforcer moved. He reached for the gun. Chuck was faster. His foot shot forward, kicking up a cloud of gravel into the man's face. The enforcer staggered, momentarily blinded, but Chuck didn't give him time to recover. He stepped in, grabbed the man's wrist before the gun could clear the holster, and twisted sharply. Snap. The enforcer's howl of pain barely had time to escape his lips before Chuck drove his elbow into the man's temple, dropping him like a sack of bricks. Grayson barely flinched. Instead, he let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Disappointing. Chuck turned toward him, his gaze cold. "Walk away." Grayson's smirk returned. "I think not." A sudden click echoed through the lot. Chuck's sharp eyes flicked upward. The second SUV. The passenger window had rolled down just enough to reveal the barrel of a silenced pistol. Chuck moved. The gun fired. He dropped to the ground, just as the bullet whizzed past where his chest had been a split second ago. He had anticipated it. He rolled, scooping up a handful of dirt, and flung it toward the shooter's window. The dust clouded their vision just long enough for Chuck to sprint forward. The second SUV's door flew open. A second gunman stepped out, raising his weapon. Chuck was already on him. One punch to the throat. The man gagged, stumbling backward. A spinning kick to the ribs. He folded like paper. Chuck grabbed the gun as the man fell, twisting it from his grasp, and in one smooth motion, turned it toward Grayson. The silver-haired man froze. For the first time that night, Malcolm Grayson looked unsure. Chuck leveled the gun at him, his expression unreadable. Grayson exhaled, raising his hands slightly. "This can go one of two ways, Mr. Norris." Chuck didn't lower the weapon. "There's only one way this ends." Grayson studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, his lips curled into something almost amused. He took a step back, then another. "You're an interesting man, Chuck Norris." He smoothed his suit, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "We'll see each other again." Then, without another word, he turned and climbed back into his SUV. Chuck watched as the engine purred to life, the vehicle reversing out of the lot. The second SUV followed, its taillights vanishing into the night. Chuck stood still, the stolen gun still in his grasp, the desert wind stirring around him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He turned, tossed the gun into the dirt, and climbed into his truck. The storm on the horizon rumbled again, louder this time. Chuck started the engine, and then, just like that, he disappeared into the night. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The desert wind howled across the open highway as Chuck Norris drove into the vast, empty night. His truck rumbled steadily over the cracked asphalt, the glow of his headlights cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The Devil's Hollow Saloon was already miles behind him, just another memory, another battleground left in the dust. But the night wasn't done with him yet. A pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, distant but unmistakable. Then another, and another. Chuck didn't react, but his grip on the wheel tightened slightly. He was being followed. He exhaled through his nose. He had seen this play out before, when men with bruised egos or unfinished business decided to try their luck a second time. Maybe it was Royce Calloway looking for revenge. Maybe it was someone worse. Either way, they were making a mistake. Chuck kept his speed steady, watching as the vehicles behind him crept closer. The road ahead was barren, no exits, no signs of civilization, just black sky and endless dust. Then, as expected, the inevitable happened. The first vehicle, an old black pickup, gunned its engine and swerved into the oncoming lane, pulling up alongside him. Chuck glanced over. The passenger window rolled down, revealing Milo, Royce's right-hand man. His face was still swollen from their last encounter, his broken nose taped up with a sloppy makeshift bandage. But his eyes burned with something reckless. Revenge. Milo grinned, lifting a sawed-off shotgun and pointing it right at Chuck's truck. Chuck didn't flinch. Instead, he tapped his fingers once against the steering wheel. A silent calculation. Milo sneered. "Should have kept driving, old man." Then he pulled the trigger. Boom! The shotgun roared, but Chuck had already moved. At the last possible second, he jerked the wheel hard right. His truck veered off the road, kicking up a storm of dust and gravel. Milo's blast barely missed, the pellets shredding his side mirror instead of punching through the window. Chuck didn't hesitate. He hit the brakes. The sudden deceleration caught the second vehicle, a silver SUV, off guard. It was too close behind him, moving too fast to react. Crunch. The SUV slammed straight into the back of Chuck's truck. The impact sent the SUV skidding sideways, tires screeching as the driver fought for control. Chuck didn't give them a chance. He twisted the wheel and slammed his truck into the SUV's side, sending it spinning off the road. It plowed into the dirt, flipping twice before coming to a dead stop. One down. Chuck's attention snapped back to Milo, who was circling around for another shot. Milo fired again. This time, Chuck yanked the wheel left, dodging the blast, then floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, barreling toward Milo's pickup. Milo's eyes widened. Oh, shut. Chuck didn't give him time to finish. He sideswiped Milo's truck, slamming into it with brutal force. The pickup spun out of control, its tires screeching as it fishtailed wildly across the asphalt. Then, it flipped. The truck tumbled off the highway, rolling over itself before coming to a violent, shuddering stop in a ditch. Chuck eased off the gas, slowing his truck to a stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door of the wrecked pickup creaked open. Milo stumbled out, coughing, staggering. His gun was gone, his balance shaky. Blood ran from a fresh gash on his forehead. Chuck stepped out of his truck. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached. The wind had died down, leaving only the quiet hum of the cooling engines and the distant rumble of thunder. Milo, still dazed, barely had time to react before Chuck was in front of him. "This is over," Chuck said, his voice like a growl of distant thunder. "You go back to Royce. You tell him what happened tonight. You tell him this ends now." Milo, panting, wiped blood from his eyes. His hands trembled, not from the crash, not from the pain, but from something deeper. Fear. Because looking into Chuck Norris's eyes, he finally understood. Royce Calloway had never stood a chance. Milo swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah. Chuck stared at him for another long moment, making sure the message had sunk in. Then, without another word, he turned, climbed back into his truck, and drove away, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Milo didn't move. He stood there, watching the taillights vanish into the darkness, his breath uneven. He had come looking for revenge. Instead, he had been given a warning, and deep down, he knew. Royce wasn't going to like it. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The long, empty highway stretched before Chuck Norris, his truck slicing through the darkness like a blade through silk. The night was silent now, save for the steady hum of his engine and the occasional gust of wind sweeping across the desert. But Chuck wasn't alone. In his rearview mirror, a single pair of headlights burned through the darkness, tailing him at a distance. Not too close, not too far. Watching. Chuck exhaled. He had shaken off Milo and the rest of Royce Calloway's crew, but someone else had picked up his trail. Whoever they weren't amateurs. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, considering his options. Keep driving? See how far they'd follow? This wasn't the kind of trouble you let come to you. Chuck made his decision. With a sudden flick of his wrist, he veered hard right off the highway, kicking up a storm of dust as he pulled onto a barely visible dirt road. His headlights illuminated the uneven terrain ahead, but he wasn't watching the road. He was watching the mirror. The car behind him hesitated. Then it followed. Chuck nodded to himself, as expected. The road wound through a barren stretch of desert, scattered with jagged rocks and dead shrubs. After about a mile, Chuck spotted an old, abandoned gas station, a forgotten relic of the past, swallowed by time. Perfect. He pulled in, killed the engine, and stepped out, letting the silence settle around him. His boots crunched against the dirt as he walked forward, slow and deliberate, positioning himself in the middle of the lot. The other vehicle, a sleek black Chrysler 300, rolled in behind him. Its headlights washed over Chuck, casting his shadow long across the cracked pavement. The engine idled for a moment, the occupants making him wait. Then the driver's door opened. Chuck didn't move. A man stepped out. Not a thug, not some back alley enforcer. This one had the sharpness of a man, used to giving orders. He wore a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, barely creasing as he moved. He adjusted his cufflinks with precision, his dark hair slicked back, with the kind of perfection that came from money and power. Chuck already didn't like him. The man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Norris." Chuck remained silent. The man took a slow step forward, surveying the surroundings. "Quiet place. No witnesses. That's good. I was hoping we could talk privately." Chuck's gaze remained steady. "I don't recall asking for company." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "No, but you certainly earned it." Chuck said nothing, waiting, letting him talk. The man clasped his hands behind his back. "You disrupted an operation that was carefully balanced. Royce Calloway was crude, but he played his role. His replacement, Malcolm Grayson, is considerably more valuable. And he's not happy about what you did." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "So that means you work for him?" The man chuckled again. "No, Mr. Norris. Grayson works for me." Now that was interesting. Chuck remained stone-faced, but inwardly, he was already assessing. If Grayson was just a lieutenant, then this man was something worse. Someone higher up, someone pulling the strings. The man continued, "You've drawn attention. The kind you don't want. We are not men who enjoy disruptions, Mr. Norris." Chuck finally spoke. "That a threat?" The man smiled wider, tilting his head. "A warning. We have bigger concerns than one lone cowboy throwing punches in a bar." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Walk away now, and you disappear. No one will bother you. No one will follow you." Chuck studied him, measured, calculated. The man was lying. Chuck exhaled. "No deal." The man's smirk faltered slightly, just for a fraction of a second. Then it returned, but colder this time. "That's disappointing." Behind him, the passenger door of the Chrysler opened. A second figure stepped out, taller, broader, built like a tank. His suit fit him poorly, stretched tight over massive shoulders. But Chuck's eyes weren't on his size. They were on the gun the man was pulling from his jacket. Chuck moved first. Before the enforcer could even raise the weapon, Chuck closed the distance with explosive speed. One punch to the wrist. The gun flew from the man's hand, clattering to the pavement. A knee to the gut. The enforcer wheezed, doubling over. Chuck grabbed him by the collar and twisted, using the man's own momentum to flip him onto the ground. Thud. The man didn't get up. Chuck straightened, turning back to the suited man, whose smirk was now completely gone. For the first time, his composure cracked. Chuck tilted his head. "Still want me to walk away?" The man's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked toward his fallen enforcer, then back to Chuck, weighing his options. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. The engine roared to life, the tires spinning against the dirt as he pulled away. Chuck watched the taillights disappear down the road. This wasn't over. Whoever this man was, he had just confirmed what Chuck had already suspected. This was bigger than Royce Calloway, bigger than a backwoods gang running cheap smuggling ops. There was something deeper at play. And now? Chuck was in the middle of it. He looked down at the enforcer, still groaning on the ground. Then he turned, climbed back into his truck, and started the engine. The storm was still coming. But this time, Chuck was heading straight for it. Final chapter. The road ahead. The highway stretched before Chuck Norris, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast moonlit desert. The storm that had loomed on the horizon for hours was finally breaking, distant flashes of lightning illuminating the darkened sky. Chuck drove in silence, the steady hum of the engine the only sound keeping him company. His knuckles rested lightly on the wheel, his mind as still as the road ahead. He had left the Devil's Hollow Saloon behind, left Royce Calloway and his broken empire in the dirt. But something told him this night wasn't over. He wasn't wrong. A pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, fast, aggressive. Chuck's jaw tightened. More company. He let out a slow breath. They just don't learn. The car behind him, a black Dodge Charger, closed the distance quickly. Too quickly. The driver wasn't just tailing him. They were coming in for the kill. Chuck saw it coming before it even happened. The Charger swerved into the oncoming lane, trying to pull up beside him. But Chuck didn't give them the chance. He cut right. Hard. His truck lurched off the main road, kicking up a whirlwind of dust as he barreled onto an old, abandoned service route. The terrain was uneven, rugged, the kind of road that could shake a lesser man to pieces. But Chuck Norris wasn't a lesser man. The Charger followed, its tires skidding as the driver fought to maintain control. Chuck could see the silhouette of the man behind the wheel now. Broad shoulders, sharp movements, someone used to violence. They sent a professional. Chuck smirked. That won't be enough. The Charger gained on him. A second later, the passenger window rolled down, and Chuck saw the glint of gunmetal, a submachine gun. Chuck exhaled, calm. He waited, watched. The instant the gunman leaned out to fire, Chuck slammed the brakes. The Charger shot past him like a bullet, the driver caught off guard by the sudden maneuver. Chuck didn't hesitate. He jerked the wheel left, crashing his truck into the Charger's rear quarter panel. Metal crunched. The Charger spun out of control, careening toward a cluster of boulders lining the roadside. The driver fought to correct it, but it was too late. The car slammed nose first into the rocks. Chuck watched the dust settle, his foot hovering over the gas pedal. Then, movement. The driver staggered out, coughing, holding his ribs. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Chuck could see the fury in his stance. The gunman followed, staggering but still armed. Chuck sighed. Persistent. He killed the engine and stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching against the gravel. The air smelled like ozone, thick with the promise of rain. The gunman raised his weapon. Chuck moved, fast. Before the man could pull the trigger, Chuck had already closed the distance. His hand shot forward, grabbing the barrel and yanking it sideways. A single strike to the wrist. The gun dropped, an elbow to the jaw. The gunman hit the dirt, out cold. The driver, bleeding, furious, rushed him. A knife gleamed in the moonlight. Chuck let him come. The man lunged. Chuck sidestepped, grabbed his wrist and twisted. The knife clattered to the ground. Chuck finished it with a single punch to the ribs, knocking the air from the driver's lungs. He crumpled to his knees, gasping. Chuck crouched beside him, his voice low, steady. "Who sent you?" The man coughed, shaking his head. "You already know." Chuck did. Malcolm Grayson. Grayson had underestimated him before. Now, he was making it personal. Chuck sighed and stood, looking down at the battered man. "Tell your boss I don't scare easy." The driver glared up at him, defiant. "This won't end here." Chuck gave a small smirk. "It never does." He turned, climbed back into his truck, and pulled away, the Charger's broken headlights glowing faintly in his rearview mirror. The road stretched ahead, long, dark, waiting. This wasn't over. It never was. But Chuck Norris kept driving, and no matter what storm lay ahead, he was ready. The story of Chuck Norris teaches us invaluable lessons about resilience, self-discipline, and standing firm against adversity. In life, we will face challenges, confront bullies, and encounter people who underestimate us. But like Chuck, we must remain calm, strategic, and prepared to defend ourselves, not just physically, but morally. Strength isn't just about power. It's about knowing when to walk away and when to stand your ground. Fearless determination and wisdom often outweigh brute force. In today's world, integrity and self-respect are rare virtues. Embrace them. Never let intimidation shake you, and always remember, true power comes from within. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from.
If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe Undercover Insights channel.